Okay, good afternoon. Welcome and thank you for coming. As you know, this is the Richmond Memorial Library, and today we are presenting the third in our spring series of Books Sandwiched In, which you all know is a lunchtime book review program, and it's in its 34th year, is that?
41st.
Oh my God.
Wow.
I'm behind the times. I couldn't recall, but I'll try to remember. I'm Frances McNulty, and I am a member of this planning committee for the book selections. The series is sponsored by the Friends of the Library, and we hope you are enrolled as a friend, for which we appreciate it if you are, and if not, there are forms available at the front desk and around the library. It's a way of just showing support to the library. Today's book reviewer is Samantha Basile, and probably needs no introduction to many of you. She's a VIP here at the library. And I first met Sam when we worked together on the first Richmond Reads committee three or more years ago. When that community reading program began here at the library, it had been resurrected from the former and very popular Tale for Three Counties. Samantha was born in Little Falls, New York, moved to Alexander at a young age. After earning a BA in English at SUNY Fredonia, she combined her love of books with a penchant for random information and decided to become a librarian. She then graduated from the University of Buffalo with a master's degree in library science and information systems in 2013. She has been the community and adult services librarian at this library since 2018. She states that her favorite part of being a librarian is helping people find what they're looking for. Not surprising, she loves to read and listen to all kinds of books, and especially enjoys a good mystery. She has had the pleasure of coordinating many of the library's programs, including this book Sandwiched In. She is also the facilitator of our adult book discussions and the Mystery Readers Group. And she does a great job making interesting and diverse selections of titles for us to read and keeping us on track. And over the last couple of years, faced a significant challenge keeping us connected through Zoom and allowing many programs to survive. Her other interests include loving to bake, doing crossword puzzles. Samantha lives in Pavilion with her husband Christopher and their 2 dogs and 2 cats. Today she will review The Case of the Murderous Dr. Cream, the hunt for a Victorian-era serial killer by Dean Jobb. Jobb like Rome. Please join me in welcoming Samantha.
All right. Hello, everybody. Can you all hear me okay? Okay. So, this is a book of, it's nonfiction, of course. It's a true crime book, if you couldn't guess. But it also combines a lot of history, which was very interesting to me. This book came on my radar shortly before it was published. I had it as an advanced copy. And once I started reading, I just really couldn't stop. It just really grabs you. And so we will get into some information about the book. So first, the book was published in July of 2021. It is a work of narrative nonfiction, which is also known as creative fiction or literary nonfiction. It is usually defined as nonfiction that uses techniques of style of fiction with characters, plot, conflict, and scene setting to tell a true story. And so I'm just going to share the author's note from the book quickly before we begin. So, a note to readers. This is the true story of a serial killer who preyed on women in London, Chicago, and Canada more than a century ago. None of the dialogue, scenes, or details have been invented or embellished. Every word enclosed in quotation marks is drawn from a court or police file, a newspaper report, memoir, or historical study, or a letter or other document preserved in an archive or museum. Wording and spellings within quotations have been preserved uncorrected so the past can speak directly to the present. So everything in this book, of course, is drawn on fact, but the author writes it in a way so you feel like you're reading a story. Other well-known examples of this style of nonfiction include The Devil in the White City by Eric Larson, The Boys in the Boat by Daniel James Brown, Educated by Tara Westover. It really is the prevailing style, I guess, for a lot of nonfiction these days. So, about our author, so Dean Jobb, again pronounced like Robe, as he has on his website. He teaches creative nonfiction at the University of King's College in Halifax, Nova Scotia. His book, Empire of Deception, was the Chicago Writers Association Book of the Year, won the Crime Writers of Canada Arthur Ellis Award for True Crime, and was a finalist for the Hillary Weston Writers Trust Prize. He is a past winner of the Evelyn Richardson and City of Dartmouth Book Awards for Nonfiction, and his books have been shortlisted for the National Business Book Award and other prizes. The Case of the Murderous Dr. Cream was longlisted for the Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence for Nonfiction, which is a very illustrious honor, and received an honorable mention for the Chicago Writers Association's 2021 Nonfiction Book of the Year, and was a Washington Post pick as one of the top 50 nonfiction books of 2021. So those are just a few of the accolades. We have a ghost in the room, I don't know. So those are just a few of the accolades that the book has received. He also writes a column called Stranger Than Fiction, which appears in Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine. So his other works include Empire of Deception, the incredible story of a master swindler who seduced a city and captivated the nation. Two other books, Daring, Devious, and Deadly, and Madness, Mayhem, and Murder, which include true tales of crime and justice from Nova Scotia's past. And then he also has a book titled The Acadians, A People's Story of Exile and Triumph, which was about the exile of the Acadian people from Canada. So, getting into some of the critical reception of the book was extensively reviewed when it came out. A Star Review and Publishers Weekly said, Jobb's extensive research pays off in a true crime masterpiece that will easily sit alongside The Devil in the White City, which is kind of a seminal work of crime, true crime. And then best-selling author Louise Penny calls this a tour de force of storytelling, one of the best books I've read this year. Dean Jobb breathes new life into Cream's victims, who they were, where and how they lived, all while blending in the thorny issues of policing, of the fictional detectives being created, of the other serial killers on the loose. This book is both chilling and thrilling. And so she kind of gives you what I'm going to talk about in this presentation, but she says it much better than I can. A Chicago Tribune review says that Dr. Cream will hauntingly occupy a space in your nightmares after you read his life and crimes in the case of the murderous Dr. Cream. I don't think it's quite that drastic, and I'll give you a little bit of a rundown on that later, but an extraordinarily well-researched and arrestingly well-written work. This is a book that grabs you from its first sentence, weaving a suspenseful tale and taking readers on a grand and gruesome historical journey. So, our book opens, and he does include this line in the book, that when a doctor does go wrong, he is the first of criminals. He has nerve and he has knowledge. And this is from The Adventure of the Speckled Band by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. So the book begins with a prologue in 1890 and the first chapter in 1891, a time when crime and murder were the obsessions of the Victorian public. Long before Agatha Christie's Poirot, authors like Wilkie Collins introduced professional detectives like Sergeant Cuff and the Moonstone. When speaking of Sergeant Cuff, it was said that when it comes to unraveling a mystery, there isn't an equal in England. The public could enjoy crime in books as well as in day-to-day life. People surrounded crime scenes hoping to catch a glimpse. It's not like now when you wouldn't necessarily be allowed to just walk into a home where a crime has been committed. That was very frequently the case. People would just flock to wherever something happened. People attended trials. It was often just a spectacle, which I would argue has not changed at all, really, in our culture. Public hangings were outlawed in England in 1868, but tens of thousands would still show up just to be present when somebody was executed. So it was kind of a big event. So formed in 1829, London's Metropolitan Police introduced professional investigators to the spectacle of crime and punishment. So prior to then, it was kind of just police forces, poorly trained, not really having any sort of cohesion. But then Scotland Yard was formed. Charles Dickens lauded the unusual intelligence of Scotland Yard and based his character of Mr. Bucket in Bleak House on a Scotland Yard investigator. Edgar Allan Poe was created with the creation of the mystery, the detective genre, in the English-speaking world at least, in the early 1840s, with his fictional detective, Auguste Dupin, who used logic and reason to solve crimes. Detective fiction reached a whole new level in the 1880s, when an Edinburgh-born doctor named Arthur Conan Doyle began publishing stories with a character inspired by Dupin, by Edgar Allan Poe's character, as well as a real-life doctor named Joseph Bell, who had been one of his instructors in medical school. This detective, an expert in chemicals and poisons and a master of observation, was, of course, Sherlock Holmes. The Sherlock Holmes stories soon became a sensation in England and the United States. And unfortunately, fact would collide with fiction upon the arrival of Thomas Cream to England in 1891. So, as I mentioned, Arthur Conan Doyle studied medicine. He was a doctor. He studied medicine at the University of Edinburgh and went on to work as a physician in England while writing fiction in his spare time. He studied under Dr. Joseph Bell, one of Edinburgh's most renowned physicians. So you'll see how this all ties in, just bear with me. I'm going to read a bit about Dr. Bell. So Dr. Joseph Bell was Secretary-Treasurer of Edinburgh's Royal College of Surgeons in 1878. Dr. Bell taught surgery and amazed his students with his ability to size up patients, a crucial skill for any doctor in an era when a diagnosis was often based on little more than a person's appearance and visible symptoms. But he seemed to be able to read minds as well. Within seconds of meeting new patients, he could correctly identify where they had been born, where they lived, what they did for a living, and other personal details. Conan Doyle, who worked as Dr. Bell's assistant during these student days, and to prepare his case notes, had interviewed each patient moments before and was in awe. His intuitive powers, he recalled, were simply marvelous. Years later, when Conan Doyle longed to abandon medicine for a writing career and was looking for a model for a fictional detective, he would remember Dr. Bell's amazing powers of observation and how he used logic and evidence to make lightning-fast deductions. And as I mentioned, that was how Sherlock Holmes came to be. So he sounds very much like the Sherlock Holmes character, with a bit of this other character built in as well. So keep Dr. Bell in mind. We will come back to him later on in the presentation. So, after outlining the conditions of the day, Jobb does a really nice job of kind of establishing the feel of the time, what it was like if you were poor, maybe, not advantaged in life. So he gives really great descriptions. So after he does that, the book opens by describing 3 poisonings that took place in London beginning on October 13, 1891. 3 women were believed to have been poisoned by the same man, Ellen Donworth, Matilda Clover, and Louisa Harvey. And as you can see, these kind of took place very shortly, one after the other. I won't get into too many of the details because you should read it if you're interested. The end result, however, and this doesn't really spoil anything, was that Thomas Neal Cream was arrested on an extortion charge on June 3rd. Evidence uncovered during his arrest led to charges for the poisonings. He had already been suspected, and they were able to find some evidence which led them to also lay this charge against him. So in preparation for a trial, a Detective Jarvis was assigned to investigate Dr. Cream's background, and we will also hear more about Detective Jarvis later on. So, the main man, Thomas Neal Cream. So who is he? Based on this summary here, so 1850, he was born in Glasgow. 1854, his family moved to Quebec City. 1876, he achieved his Doctor of Medicine and Master of Surgery at McGill University. His thesis topic was chloroform. Sadly, his thesis did not exist, or did not survive, but it is known what his topic was, which is a bit foreboding. In 1876, he marries Flora Eliza Brooks. 1878, he receives a licentiate of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons in Edinburgh. And in 1892, he dies in London. So this is a very high-level view of his life. So, short life, not very long by today's standards. As Jobb shares, though, through meticulous research, Cream's life was fraught with turmoil, scandal, and, yes, murder. So one interesting point to note is that Cream first attempted to gain his license through the Royal College of Surgeons of England. The failure rate was high. He paid the £5 5 fee to sit for the exam on April 16, 1877. He had 3 hours to answer 4 questions. After sitting for the exam, candidates would be approved or, quote, referred, a polite way of saying that they failed. Cream was referred. He could have waited several months to sit for the exam again, but chose not to. A year later, he traveled north to Edinburgh to sit for the exam under the Royal College of Physicians and the Royal College of Surgeons, who tested candidates 3 times a year to be licensed in both medicine and surgery. Cream had to deliver his training records and exam fee to the Secretary and Treasurer of Edinburgh's Royal College of Surgeons. This man was none other than Joseph Bell, the same man who Arthur Conan Doyle based the character of Sherlock Holmes on. After taking the written portion of the test, Cream appeared before 6 examiners for questioning. Among those examiners was Dr. Bell. Cream was among 159 men to be granted his license and could now display licentiate of the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh and the licentiate of the Royal College of Surgeons. So now he was dual certified. It was almost considered the highest degree or license you could have to practice medicine in those days. And so now, just to go back to Dr. Bell for a moment. So as I said, he was one of Cream's examiners. Dr. Bell had plenty of time during the April 13th examination to size up Cream, to glean information from his mannerisms and his appearance, to search for clues as he had done so often to the astonishment of his students. Cream never lost his Scottish accent, and Bell would have found it easy to pinpoint his Glasgow origins. From Cream's expensive clothes, he may have deduced correctly that the scion of a wealthy Canadian family, sent overseas to burnish his medical credentials, was vain, self-absorbed, and spoiled. But not even Joseph Bell, for all his superhuman ability to observe and deduce, sensed the evil lurking within Thomas Neal Cream. So I think that was just a really interesting intersection of this man who had these amazing powers of observation, and he encountered this person and didn't seem to, or at least didn't share any misgivings about him. Okay, so just a little bit more about our Dr. Cream. So he was well-traveled for a man of his time. Again, he was born in Glasgow, moved to Canada in 1854. In 1872, he went to Montreal to study at McGill. In 1876, he married a woman named Flora Brooks in a city which was about 50 miles east of Quebec in Waterloo. From there, he went to England to complete his medical studies. The rest of his travels I will leave you to discover, but I will note that Dr. Cream returned once again to England in early October of 1891, and October 13th, the Lambeth poisonings began. So, as part of his travels, we'll just go back, 1878, he returns from, after he gets his license to practice medicine, he returns to London, Ontario, and that is a bit of a confusing point in this book, is that there's significant parts in London, England, and London, Ontario, but the author does do a pretty good job of distinguishing the two. So he returns and sets up a practice in London, Ontario. He was active in his new community. A friend at the time described that he was a pillar of the congregation at Park Avenue Presbyterian Church, where he taught Sunday school. He was a member of the Young Man's Christian Association, which offered a, quote, safe Christian environment to divert its members from, quote, the temptations of alcohol, gambling, and prostitution. By night, however, a different man emerged. His friend Reed would also recount that, quote, he was always to be found with a number of London's most congenial spirits and indulged in excess in the flowing bowl, which was a polite term for being drunk, excessive drunkenness. So this was considered scandalous behavior for an educated professional man of the time, especially with the other circles that he ran with. A former medical school professor would recall that he was, quote, rather wild and fond of ostentatious display of clothing and jewelry, and other students, quote, did not associate with him any more than they could help. So this portrait here, he actually sat for 5 or 6 different portrait sessions during his time at McGill. So he's a bit jaunty, you know, clearly has a bit of a personality, but for the time, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was often used as the, you know, was very popular, and this idea of young men who put up a respectable front during the day but engaged in not even just you know, slightly wild behavior, but very wild, reckless, without abandon. So that was documented quite a bit throughout the book. Okay, so now we're going to meet Detective Frederick Smith Jarvis. So Jarvis is described as a rough fellow able to mix in the lowest society and a highly educated man able to direct the operations of others. And so he was a great choice to investigate Dr. Cream. So after Cream was arrested in England in 1891, they decide they need to find out more about Cream's past. And so again, this is how the book is structured. So it opens with the poisonings in England. They say we need to learn more about this guy, where he came from, who he is, and so they assign this Detective Jarvis, Dr. Cream, Detective Jarvis, to investigate. So he travels by boat, I guess it would be a ship, to New York City in 1892. He was quite practiced in these sorts of investigations. He once tracked a thief, I think, from London to Philadelphia. He was well-traveled, well-respected by his peers. So during his investigation of Cream, he came to New York City, as you can see by the boat illustration imposed over this map. And then he traveled north. He traveled by train into Canada to Montreal. In Montreal, a Dr. Herbert Reddy provided a tip that Cream, his former McGill classmate, had been implicated in the woman's death in London, Ontario. So while he's in Montreal, he goes to Quebec City, and he goes to Waterloo, which is this star to the right up by Montreal. So he kind of gets into, interviews all the people who knew Thomas Cream and from his past. And from there, he goes to London, Ontario after receiving this tip. London is actually quite close to us. It's this star right in the middle near Toronto. So Jarvis found this tip to be credible and discovered that an inquest had been conducted into the death of Catherine Gardner, who had been killed by chloroform, interestingly enough. So Cream pleaded guilty to a charge of practicing without a license, but there was insufficient evidence to find him responsible for Gardner's death. Cream headed west, and 13 years later, in 1892, Jarvis followed his trail then to Chicago. In Chicago, Cream had been involved in several investigations into suspicious deaths. This just seems to keep happening to him. Nothing really, quote, stuck until 1881 when he was sentenced to life in Joliet prison. And again, the circumstances surrounding that, you should read the book. So a journalist would recall that, quote, not a muscle of his face moved as he heard his dreadful sentence. A Chicago Daily News headline proclaimed that his sentence was the, quote, end of a dangerous career, but as the author notes, this was a premature prediction as the Lambeth poisonings in England took place in the UK in 1891. So, one very important thing that Jobb's book does is to give names and humanity to Cream's victims. Much like the women who were killed by Jack the Ripper, many of these women were considered to be less than and lowly and unimportant just because of the circumstances that they found themselves in. And so these are the names of the victims of Thomas Neal Cream: Flora Eliza Brooks, Catherine Hutchinson Gardner, Mary Ann Matilda Faulkner, Ellen Stack, Sarah Alice Montgomery, Daniel Stott, Ellen Donworth, Matilda Clover, Louisa Hardy, Alice Marsh, and Emma Shervell. Daniel Stott is the only man known to have been killed by Cream. Cream took advantage of his knowledge of medicine and the reduced circumstances of his victims. Many of his victims were extremely poor or had been forced to engage in sex work to survive. With that, of course, many times came pregnancy. An unwed mother at this time was a pariah, better off dead in many cases. And so many women turned to Cream in desperation. He in turn betrayed their trust as a medical professional. Others were not sex workers at all, but were assumed to be based on their circumstances and financial status. Jobb, certainly through his work, helps to reclaim their dignity by describing the treatment of women at this time and by reconstructing the victims' lives through sources that he researches. So, the book is replete with photos and illustrations from the time. Jobb has quite an extensive personal collection of photographs and different illustrations. This kind of shows or exemplifies how dramatic court cases in England were at the time. As now, many things were drawn, but that's just because photography was not prevalent then. But these are all the women who testified against Cream in court, and so they kind of draw out all these little scenes. The prisoner hooted at on leaving the coroner's court, Lambeth Palace where Neal lodged, so it's just kind of sketching the scene for the Victorian public to kind of raise the fervor about the case. Alright, you stay. So this was from the Illustrated Police News in 1892, and there are quite a few illustrations like this, so it's very interesting just to see how things were represented at the time. So, one woman who I think is a pretty big, important part of this story is Louisa Lou Harvey. So, Louisa was living in Brighton when she read a newspaper account of a coroner's inquest into the death of Matilda Clover. She said she was, quote, struck by the resemblance of the man in the description because he sounded like a man she had met the previous fall. Presumed to be dead by Scotland Yard, Harvey was stunned to see that she was listed among the victims of the Lambeth poisoner. So I will just read to you a little bit about Louisa Harvey, because I think she's one of the very interesting characters in this book. So, let's see. A woman in her mid-20s waited beneath the Gothic facade of St. James Hall on Regent Street, just off Piccadilly Circus, as arranged. Neatly trimmed brows arched above her large, lively eyes, and brown hair framed her delicate face. Light from gas street lamps danced and glistened in the wet pavement, scrubbed clean by days of heavy rain. Inside the hall, theater goers marveled at an attraction as impressive as anything on stage. Now illuminated throughout, noted an advertisement, with the electric light. St. James featured the world-famed Moore and Burgess minstrels 3 nights a week, but the woman took no interest in the playbill on this damp October night. She was working. A man in a black overcoat, a top hat perched on his bald head, touched the woman on the shoulder. A mustache softened the sharp features of his thin face, but what stood out were his eyes, steel gray and magnified by the thick lenses of his spectacles. They were crossed. No one would have described the man as handsome, but the woman had spotted the glint of a gold watch. And the top hat was a mark of a gentleman, a symbol of wealth and privilege. Most men favored the less formal bowler hat, even out for a night at the theater. This was a man of means, the best kind of customer. So I'll just skip ahead a little bit. Essentially, she arranges to meet him. And the woman she had met him at the Alhambra Theater and then later arranged this meeting. So the woman and the man in the top hat walked a half-dozen blocks to the Paris Hotel on Berwick Street in Soho, a seedy enclave on the edge of the West End Theater District. He said he was a doctor at St. Thomas's, across the river in Lambeth. This was not true. He was a medical man, but had no affiliation with the hospital. What was her name? Lou Harvey, she said. It was short for Louisa. She told him she was a servant, but they both know this was a lie. Thomas Neal Cream did not offer his name, and she never asked. She did not need to know. In the morning before they left the Paris Hotel, Cream handed her £3, more than some prostitutes earned in a week. She had been right. He was a man of means. He suggested, apparently in jest, that she should move to America to live with him. They arranged to meet again later that day. 7:30 on the Thames embankment near the Charing Cross railway station. He would take her to a show, her choice. She picked the Oxford Music Hall on Tottenham Court Road, one of the best and most popular in the city. As they parted, he made a strange remark. He said I had a few spots on my forehead, Harvey would recall. He said he would bring me some pills to take them away. He was waiting for her when she reached the riverside that evening. They walked to the nearby Northumberland Arms public house for a glass of wine. When a woman selling flowers passed by, he brought her some roses. They strolled back to the river's edge, lined with hissing gas lamps that cast an eerie glow over the embankment. He reached into the pocket of his waistcoat and pulled out a wad of tissue paper. Inside were 2 oblong light-colored pills. Don't bite them, he told her. Swallow them as they are. He pressed them into the palm of her right hand. She lifted her hand to her mouth and seemed to swallow the pills, but he wanted to be sure. Show me your hand, he said. She did. It was empty. He asked to see her left hand. It, too, was empty. There was a change of plans, he announced. He had an appointment at the hospital, but she should go to the music hall on her own. He would meet her outside, and they would go back to the Paris Hotel for the night. He gave her 5 shillings for cab fare. Meet me at 11, Cream said, as he turned and walked towards Westminster Bridge in the direction of the hospital. Goodbye for the present. Harvey had not taken the pills. Not liking the look of the thing, she recalled, I pretended to put them in my mouth. In the flickering gaslight, the doctor had not noticed as she passed them from one hand to the other. When he looked away for a moment, she dropped them over the edge into the river. Harvey was wary of her generous new customer. Before heading to the Thames embankment that evening, she had asked the man she lived with to follow her to her meeting with the doctor. Charles Harvey, she used his surname even though they were not married, had been in the next booth as she drank wine with Cream at the Northumberland public house. He had followed them to the riverside and watched from the shadows as the doctor handed her the pills. Hours later, at 11 o'clock, as arranged, Harvey emerged from the Oxford Music Hall. Cream was not there. She waited for half an hour, but he never showed up. Strange, she must have thought. It was as if he had never expected her to keep the appointment. And so that is just, gives you kind of an idea of the narrative structure of the book. So Harvey eventually left London for a fresh start. She wanted to get out of her current circumstances. After reading this article about the inquest, she contacted Scotland Yard and let them know that she was quite alive and willing to testify. And she did testify against Cream to say that the pills used as evidence in his trial looked exactly like the pills that Cream had told her to take. And those pills, of course, contained strychnine. So would not have been a very good ending, and I think it was incredibly brave of her to put herself forward to testify, especially given the circumstances of her life and the way women in those circumstances were usually treated. So this was from the Penny Illustrated paper. So one really interesting thing is that I mentioned Jarvis's investigations. His investigations were all reported in a document that was submitted to the court, and so that document exists today. So it gives an extremely detailed view into Cream's life, which at a time when all you really had to do was change your name. It's incredible that they were to disappear. Like if you committed a crime, you could just leave town. Nobody would ever know who you were, where you went, what you did. It's really incredible that they were able to trace his story as well as they did in that time. Let me just see here. I don't know that, but that's something that really stood out to me about this book was just the extensive research, but also the wealth of information that the author could access. So that was a really interesting part, because often there's newspaper articles, there might be court documents, but to have eyewitness accounts, interviews written in extreme detail by a seasoned investigator that you can use to draw on as sources for your work is really incredible. And the fact that they could find who did these poisonings at all in a time when forensics was, non-existent, and it's just, the story is really incredible to read. So, should you read this? On a scale of Nancy Drew to Helter Skelter, I would say that Dr. Cream lands somewhere around 5 daggers. That's the scale I've developed here. It's no more gruesome than any thriller you might read. They do describe, there are descriptions of violent death. He poisoned his victims, and so they do go into some of that, and why the deaths of his victims were misconstrued for other, as other things, and that, they didn't think it was poison at the time. But it's not scary, it's not like Helter Skelter. So it's more historical, and like I said, the really rich historical detail is just really incredible. I know it's a gruesome topic, it's not everyone's cup of tea. But I would say it's not scary, it's not needlessly gory, it's not over the top. And it might seem like I've revealed a lot about the plot here, but it really is just the tip of the iceberg for all the investigations that were done, and the research, and the tracking down witnesses, and the way that Cream was caught was really interesting. He was a complete narcissist, and he just couldn't stay away from the police. So it's really interesting. I would recommend it if you're a fan of mysteries. It's, like I said, it's not any more gory than a thriller or a mystery you might read. So it's almost unbelievable that he was caught, but it's very interesting that he was. There's been some speculation that he was Jack the Ripper. It's been disproven, and it's more of an urban legend, but it is certainly interesting to consider and to read about. So that is all I have. All right. Any questions? Yes.
Did they ever talk about why he maybe only targeted one man, or is there any conversation around gender specifically?
There is conversation around gender, mostly about women and the roles that they were forced into, the circumstances that they were often put into, the way that they were portrayed by the media and the press. the circumstance where the man was killed, it was in Illinois, and it was essentially his wife wanted to poison him, and so she contacted Cream, and he had these pills. So he was eventually implicated in that crime. And so he didn't hand the man the pills, he gave them to this woman, and so it was, he generally did take advantage of women. The man was kind of an anomaly, and it's obviously unknown if more patients died at his hands, because they very well could have, and it just could have been attributed to other things, so, yes.
What happened to his wife, and did he have any children?
So his wife, you might have seen, was listed among his victims.
Yeah.
He did not have any children, so, yeah. Shotgun wedding. He left the day after the wedding for England. He had already forced her to have an abortion and later sent her some medicine, and then she somehow died. So he really liked his medicine. Yes, Leslie.
Are you going to share with us how he died?
How he died?
Yeah.
Do you want to know?
Sure
So
do.
He was executed. He was executed, and he was found guilty, and he was hung. It's an urban legend that he, as he had the noose around his neck and was just about to be dropped, said, "I am Jack," and then the noose dropped him, you know. So that somebody reported that, it became this huge viral, you know, I say viral for the day, story that this man could have been Jack the Ripper. So he was eventually brought to justice for his crimes. So, Francis.
Motive, is there any summary of what his motives were?
I mean, he goes into it a bit. He goes into Cream's background and the things that might have motivated him in this direction. Again, sociopath, narcissistic, thought he was better than everybody, could have been some sort of motivation of, you know, women who were engaging in sex work and he didn't, you know, approve, or there are a lot of very varied circumstances under which these women died, and so it just kind of seems like he just liked to kill them. So, any other questions on this really pleasant topic? I'm interested in true crime, and so I found it to be fascinating because I also love history. So I thought it was really a great blend of the two.
So these were either prostitutes or women who needed money and did sex just because of a situation they happened to be in?
Right, it was extremely common at the time.
Right.
Even married women would engage in sex work because they didn't have other options.
They had to have money for whatever.
And a lot of these women, some of them truly were not even engaging in that kind of work, but they were maids or something else, and they needed to get rid of an unwanted pregnancy because, like I said, it was, being an unwed mother was, you know, you might as well be dead. And being, you know, having an abortion, equally bad. So women were very often caught in a very terrible place. So, any other questions?
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody. So, I would like to thank the coffee press. They actually they donated our door prize for today. So let me grab that. Does anybody